Okay. So now I'm recording. So this is our lecture on October 23rd. So in chapter 1 on page 44, in paragraph 8, he talks about how God not having a physical body. And at the time, I was certain that Rabbi Abraham ben Isaac of Poitiers, the Ravad, had made a comment at that point. Turns out, I kept looking and saying, maybe my edition, I looked in 3 different editions. Turns out he actually made a comment later on about that issue, because later on in the chapter, there's in the chapter on the section on repentance, Maimonides has a list of people for whom there is no repentance, and he includes people who are heretics, or those who say God has a body, and at that point the Ravad says, oh yeah? But anyway, but you notice he then in paragraph 9, he talks about the notion of metaphor. And this is going to be something that's incredibly important to Maimonides. In the whole first part of the guide is practically completely given over to explaining metaphorical expressions about God, anthropomorphic expressions of God that he explains metaphorically. All right, and in addition to that, he also goes into what does it mean that humans are created in the image of God. But so this is very, very important for Maimonides, because Maimonides, in his view of God, is God does not have a body, God does not have any physical capabilities. So therefore, what do you do with all the language in the Bible? And in fact, he sees, as in his introduction to the guide, he talks about the fact that this is one of the big problems that educated people have. That if they've studied the Torah and they've studied philosophy, how do they reconcile the anthropomorphic language of the Bible and what they've learned in philosophy? And so what Maimonides is trying to do is to understand that all language about God does not really describe God. I mean, his conception of God is so much beyond that of human comprehension that he wants us to understand that all language of God, God language, is metaphorical. By the way, this is something that is very much in tune with what goes on in modern theologies of God. It was one of the important elements of the feminist critique of religion and in the Jewish community, that God is constantly referred to as a he in the liturgy, and Jewish feminists said you have to understand that this is metaphorical language, and because it's metaphorical language, we can change the language to either completely gender neutral, which is what some of them decided to do, like Marcia Falk in her rewriting of all the blessings. She wrote a book called The Book of Blessings, where there is a completely gender neutral. She removes the notion of gender from God completely. Or you can instead provide a feminine version of God so that you could use both. Or you can incorporate both into the same prayer. Because the feminist critique is that because God is spoken only of in masculine language in the liturgy, which is the most well-known Jewish text, by the way, whatever prayer book you pray with, that is the text most Jews who are aware of Jewish texts know, more than the Bible, certainly more than rabbinic literature. If God is male, then God becomes the standard by which the community is constructed, and therefore maleness is the only thing that gets valued. And femaleness, and this is true actually in rabbinic text, is a deviation from the norm. In other words, and any of you studied with me before know that when you look at the Mishnah, for example, there is a section called a section on women. In fact, Maimonides has a section on women. So for the rabbis of the Mishnah, the normative Jew is a male, free, adult Jew. So anybody in the community who is not that category is a special category of Jewish law, namely slaves, minors, non-Jews, and women.
What do you mean by normative?
Meaning that when they're addressing the law, that's who they're talking to, and that's what it's about. And everybody else is therefore an exception, a special case that has to be dealt with aside from the normative. So the normative minion in that case are 12 adult, male, free Jews. So what do you do with a minor? You know, if you have 9 men and a minor, can you count them in the minion, right? And you can just go through all kinds of things like that. So that was one of the things that, because that's why the Jewish feminists attacked the language issue so much, because the language issue inculcates into the community what is normative, right? And as they pointed out, all the other categories that are exceptions to the norm can become the norm. A minor can become an adult, right? Oh, by the way, I left one category out, slaves. Slaves are also deviation from the norm. I said free. Okay. A slave can become free, right? And a non-Jew can become a Jew. But a woman can't change, right? So all the other categories that are different from the norm can become the norm except for women. All right? And this was a really good critique. So it stems from the same issue of metaphorical language. And that's what Maimonides is dealing with in paragraph 9 on page 44 is, what is the meaning of the expression, right? And if you go to the material I gave you, he goes further into that in paragraph, this is in page 1 of what I sent you last week, Halakha 10, if so, what did Moses, our teacher, want to comprehend when he requested, please show me your glory? In other words, that seems to be one of the most anthropomorphic passages in the Torah about God, where God says, I can't show you my face, but you can see my back. The extra sections from the Mishnah Torah, Sefer Foundation of the Torah, the one I sent you last week from chapter 1. Okay? On page 1, Halakha 10, right? And then in Halakha 11, he says, since it has been clarified that he does not have a body or corporeal form, it is also clear that none of the functions of the body. So in other words, a body has limitations, a body has direction, right? A body is three-dimensional, and in effect, and a body changes. And so he says, therefore, if a God does not have a body, then God does not have any of the attributes of what a body has, right? And so if you go back to page 45 in the anthology, in paragraph 12, he's saying, this being so, in the Pentateuch and the books of the prophets already mentions, others similar, these are all of them metaphorical and rhetorical. And he will eventually, in the guide, actually do a classification that he gets from, I think he gets it from Aristotle, if I remember correctly, of different kinds of language. There are specific terms for different kinds of language that refers to something that is not just allegorical, but there's other ones as well. Okay, so this is really important for him. One of the great things that this shows is that Maimonides has a consistent program from the time he wrote his commentary to the Mishnah to the time he wrote the Guide of the Perplexed. He was perfectly consistent in his approach to the Jewish religion. Yes, Risa?
I was very troubled, or at least puzzled, by some of the material you sent for this week.
We'll get to it.
You want to wait?
I want to wait.
Okay.
All right?
It ties into this.
Yeah. Okay, we'll get to it. Now, in chapter 2, we looked at how he talks about the notion of the fear and the love, and he talks about essentially the necessity to study creation, scientifically study creation, and then what he does, and this going back to the material I gave you, start going through from Halakha 3 through till 8, which he didn't give you, he is telling you about the structure of the universe and the kinds of creatures that live within them, right? And he goes into the whole description of the celestial creatures, which we don't have to look at in detail, but if you look at Holocaust 7 of chapter 2, which is on page 3 of the material I gave you last week, you'll see that here are the, it's a hierarchical, and his universe, don't forget, number 7. His universe is extremely hierarchical. It consists of levels, right? Because that's the Ptolemaic universe, is a series of shells, a series of levels. So for him, the celestial creatures have a series of spiritual levels, and you see there are 10 of them. And these names he mostly gets out of the Bible themselves, some out of rabbinic literature, okay? And the holy chayot, the word chayot means creatures or beasts, right? And the ophanim are the creatures of the wheels of the chariot. And so the chayot are the highest level, meaning they're the ones that are closest to God. They're and notice what he says, all these spiritual forms are alive. For him, the planets and stars are celestial beings with intelligence, but are non-material, right? They have spiritual form, but they do not have material. And then if you go back to page 46, look at what he says in number 10. This is also an extremely critical passage. I don't think we looked at it, did we?
No.
Okay, so let's take a look at this passage on page 46 of the anthology, number 10. Irma, do you want to read it for us, please?
The Holy One, blessed be He, realizes his true being and knows it is as it is, not with a knowledge external to himself, as is our knowledge. For our knowledge and ourselves are separate, but as for the Creator, blessed be He or She, his knowledge and his life are one in all aspects, from every point of view and however we conceive unity. If the Creator lived as other living creatures live, and his knowledge were external to himself, there would be a plurality of deities, namely, he himself, his life, and his knowledge. This, however, is not so. He is one in every aspect, from every angle, and in all ways in which unity is conceived. Hence, the conclusion that God is the one who knows, is known, and is the knowledge of himself, all these being one. This is beyond the power of speech to express, beyond the capacity of the ear to hear, and of the human mind to apprehend clearly.
Okay, stop there. He then is going to give you scriptural, proof for that. But then look at the last sentence. God, he knows them because of himself. Knowing himself, he knows everything, for everything is attached to him and his being. He deals with this very exclusively in the guide. Hi, how are you? Notice what he's saying. We acquire knowledge like a thing. It is external to ourselves that we then take into ourselves. When we talk about God's knowledge, it is not like that. That God's knowledge and God are all of a unity. Now, this will become incredibly important later on when he talks about free will, right? Because there is the conundrum that comes out that the Bible doesn't really care about, and the rabbis don't really deal with either. They kind of accept a kind of contradictory approach is, if God knows everything, if God is omniscient, the word is, then how can there be free will? Okay, and yet the rabbis, a famous statement of Rabbi Akiva said, all is foreseen, yet free will is given. They accepted it as, I won't say a contradiction, but rather as a paradox. And they never fully deal with it because they weren't interested in that. And the Bible seems to express the notion that God has plans, and yet humans also have free will. Except in cases when God directly intervenes, like when God hardens Pharaoh's heart to prevent somebody from exercising their free will. So you have in the Bible this curious attitude that there is divine plans, but nonetheless, within the context of that plan, humans seem to have the will to be able to act on their own. And they never resolve that paradox.
Couldn't it be resolved by saying that God is aware of what humans will choose to do as their, quote, free will?
But then free will is an illusion.
Well,
Okay, and in the Middle Ages, this was discussed because this was a critical issue for Abrahamic traditions. And in the Jewish community, there were different people who had different stances on it. A later philosopher, Hasdai Crescas, who was Spanish, he essentially believed that human free will was an illusion, that essentially everything is determined. Right?
The same paradox exists in science between determinism and quantum physics.
Yes, exactly. And exactly. And even today, neurologists talk about the fact that do we really truly have free will, although that what they consider definition of free will, I think, is rather limited. But nonetheless, this is going to become a really critical point. And then he talks about the fact, of course, that we can't conceive of this idea of God's knowledge being part of God's self. And again, this will become interesting later on when he deals directly with the issue of free will.
We can't conceive. I don't understand. We can't conceive of God's knowledge being.
Yeah, he says because we don't have ways to speak about this. He says human language cannot really describe it because we talk about knowledge as a separate idea, a separate thing. And so when we talk about God's knowledge, we're using a human analogy to human knowledge.
If God does not have human functions, as he says,
yeah,
then God doesn't see, God doesn't hear, God doesn't know.
Exactly. All that stuff is
know, but not in that way.
Not in the way we know. Exactly. You've got it right on the nose. Okay. Now look at what he says in number 11. Irma, do you want to read number 11? Bottom page 46.
What has been said on this topic in these two chapters is but a drop in the ocean, compared with what has to be elucidated on this subject. The exposition of all the principles alluded to in these two chapters forms the so-called Ma'aseh Merkavah, account of the divine chariot.
Okay, and here he is going to talk about this in a minute. We'll get to that, okay? He says in the next paragraph, the ancient sages enjoined us to discuss these matters privately with one individual, and then only if he be wise and capable of independent reasoning. Okay? And here he says, in this case, the chapter headings are communicated to him, and he is instructed in a minute portion of the subject. It is left to him to develop the conclusions for himself and to penetrate to the depths of the subject. What he is warning his readers is, he's not going to tell you everything, because it's not for everybody. What he does in the guide, intentionally, he gets back to this and he says, I'm going to hide a lot of stuff, and you're only the person who really understands this is going to get what I'm saying. So when we get to studying the guide, which I hope we'll do later this year, it's written on different levels. There's a level on the surface, which is straightforward, but there's he himself warns you there's little bits hidden throughout there that is only for the most capable. So here it is, a work that is supposed to be read by every literate Jew, and he's warning them there are things that you cannot explicitly teach. Because for Maimonides, that's what philosophy was, what he called metaphysics. Physics is the study of the physical sciences, and metaphysics is the study of philosophy, and he did not believe philosophy was for the masses. They would misunderstand it. It could destroy a person's faith. That's in fact why he wrote the guide, right? And so you have to be really careful. And what is he alluding to about the ancient sages? He's alluding to a section of the Talmud in Masechet Chagiga, a very famous passage, where it says, the matters of the work of creation should only be taught to a few people, and it's one of those great deviations in the Talmud. The Mishnah basically is talking about Chagiga is actually a tractate devoted to sacrifices on holidays. But then at one point in one of the halachot it says the laws of incest should not be taught in public. because they're a difficult topic. Sexual matters, right? Shouldn't speak about sexual matters, to a crowd, right?
It's hard to understand.
Yeah, and well, our ancestors were not as open about these things as we are in society, let us just say.
Sure.
And then then it deviates from that and says, and the work of creation, Maaseh Bereshit, should only be taught to a few disciples at a time. And then Maaseh Merkavah, the work of the chariot, which is chapter 1 of Ezekiel, right? The Maaseh Bereshit is chapter 1 of Genesis. Maaseh Merkavah is chapter 1 of Ezekiel, which, as you know, is an unbelievable vision of Ezekiel of the divine chariot with this figure on it and so on. It's extremely mystical and difficult to understand. And was the source of a great deal of Jewish mysticism long before there was a Kabbalah. They said it should only be taught by teacher to disciple and then only the chapter headings, meaning only hints. It should never be taught explicitly. So he takes the Maaseh Merkavah to mean philosophy, right? And if you take a look at well, we'll get to that in a minute. If you go to the material I gave you last week, in chapter 3, which Tversky has completely deleted, he gives you the Ptolemaic universe. He gives you a description of the spheres. So if you're interested in medieval astronomy, this is, you can read this in conjunction with that diagram I gave you last time, which showed you what the Ptolemaic universe looked like, right? The different spheres. So that's what he does. And he talks about, there are 8 spheres contain the planets. He talks about it as layers of an onion, which is a great analogy to it, right?
What year was Ptolemy?
Well, Ptolemy was Greek.
So when did the Ptolemaic universe?
It became quite well known in late antiquity, became the standard cosmology. It was only accepted. The only evidence of it amongst the Jewish community dates from the 1st century CE, although there may have been others who accepted it beforehand. But it became, as it were, the standard model of the universe that was accepted by everybody. And so when you look in Christian, Muslim, and Jewish philosophy and science, that's what they're working off of, right?
Did you say that he thought the planets were beings?
Yes, everybody did. Nobody thought they were inert matter. There was one Greek scientist who thought the sun was a ball of fire, but essentially they all, in Greek language, they were gods or demigods. In the monotheistic faiths, they are celestial creatures.
So how did he compare them to God?
They are servants of God. They are intermediaries between us and God. They are not made out of matter, of earthly matter. Yes, Risa?
What do we do with the fact that that's entirely wrong?
Well, we can say Maimonides was a person of his time, and he was utilizing the best science that he knew. Okay? And that's true in all aspects.
Theology, we say it in astronomy.
Yeah, but his theological system, you see, Maimonides has always been an inspiration to me because he utilized the best science of his time to try and understand the universe. And he said it was a religious duty to study scientifically creation. So I take that in a modern context and say, we must understand the world that we live in to put our theology within the context of what science says about the universe today, which is what I've been trying to do since rabbinical school, right? Okay? So what's fascinating to me is that the translation of the Mishnah that I've given you here comes from an Orthodox edition where the translator at this point has a long note where he struggles with this issue. Because for him, Maimonides cannot be wrong. Right?
That's where I was going.
Yeah, and I should actually go get you the passage and give it to you guys. I have to borrow a book from the library, Beth Sholem, to get it. But he has this long note, covering 3/4 of a page, where he grapples with this. How do I deal with the fact that Maimonides, according to modern science, is wrong, when I hold Maimonides must be absolutely true?
You mean because
Wait. And what does he say?
Well, he admits the fact that maybe sometimes you can say that a great sage only knew as much as they did at the time, but for him that's a little radical. So then he comes up and says, well, if maybe we can, and he does these quasi-scientific explanations to kind of prove the fact that according to to relativity theory, the Earth could be the center of the universe. It's really, really strange theories. By the way, he wasn't the first guy to invent this. I've seen this in other Orthodox works on science. I'll send it out to you guys, maybe by email. But the point is, here's a guy who is really trying to deal with this, and he comes up with these, rather strange ways to do it, rather than admitting the fact that Maimonides was a person of his time, and the science of Maimonides. What I would like to, I don't know, I haven't looked at his commentary on Maimonides' diet, but does he agree with Maimonides' diet? Does he live by his diet? Which, of course, has some very odd things that he says you should never eat because of their color. Because if they're red, they must be poisonous, like radishes, right? Okay, or bad for your body, all right? So does this guy live by the diet in the Maimonides? I highly doubt it, right? Yes, Sam, you had a question?
No.
Oh, okay.
So we pick and choose.
Well, everybody picks and chooses, but I just find what to me is the grappling with modern science that you find in some aspects of the Orthodox community is quite fascinating, because amongst Orthodox scientists who are usually in the medical field, they have developed this notion that there are two distinct forms of truth: Torah truth and scientific truth. They are totally separate realms, and therefore they can work in science and accept all the conclusions of modern science because it has nothing to impinge upon Torah truth. And by the way, that in fact is the existentialist approach. They would not admit it, but this is Martin Buber, the existentialist approach to knowledge, that there is the I-thou knowledge and the I-it knowledge, the subject-object knowledge, which is what science is, and the subjective knowledge, subject-subject knowledge, which is existentialist truth. And religion is existentialist. So Orthodox scientists, whether they've studied Buber or not, have adopted that the notion of parallel realms of truth, which, by the way, some scientists have adopted. The late Stephen Jay Gould talked about as magisteriums, two magisteriums that do not conflict with each other because they deal with separate realms. Okay. There is another Orthodox scientist, though, who's popularly known as the Zoo Rabbi, who's an ultra-Orthodox guy who's written some fascinating books on science, where he really knows the science. And by the way, he's gotten into trouble in his own community, although he got famous rabbis to write sort of, thing. In the Orthodox community, if you publish a book, you have to get famous halachic authorities to write an okay at the beginning. They're kind of like the community censors, right? If you don't get their okay, then there must be something wrong with the book, right? So he gets these guys to write these letters at the front of the book saying how this is okay, he's brilliant, he's blah, 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 blah. But then after it's published, because some of the more extreme elements in his own community objected to the things he was saying, right away, there were people in the community who were ready to excommunicate him. But the guy has, as I read the book and said, this guy's got game, and I don't usually that experience. He really knows the science, and he's really interested, and he's dealing with evolution, with cosmology, with all of these things, and really trying to come up with what I would consider rather ingenious and clever answers to it.
Who is this?
I forget his name offhand, but I'll send you the reference.
And he's putting that together with religion, or
he's trying to see it through the lens of his own ultra-Orthodox faith, and he's I respect him. I mean, I don't have to agree with his answers, but I can understand his struggle because, of course, he has to take a fundamentalist position on the tradition, right? Anyway, so chapter 3 is all about telling you about the different spheres, okay? And if you go to Halacha 9 on page 5 of the material I gave you last week, you'll see, by the way, Halacha 8 is interesting because he talks about the distances between them. This is quite fascinating. This is all out of the astronomy of his time. He says, among all the stars we see are small ones which the Earth surpasses in size, and large ones which are several times larger than the Earth. Because he understands the farther away an object is, the smaller it seems. So he says, our Earth is approximately 40 times larger than the moon. Of course, we know that's not true, but it's an interesting estimate. And the sun is approximately 170 times larger than the Earth. We know that the sun is much larger than the Earth. Thus, the moon is approximately 1/6800th the size of the sun. None of the other stars is as large as the sun, nor is one as small as the planet Kochav in the second sphere. All right, so that's interesting. But look at number 9. Irma, you want to read number 9? All the stars
and spheres possess a soul, knowledge, and intellect. They are alive and stand in recognition of the one who spoke, and thus brought the world into being. According to their size and level, each one praises and glorifies their Creator as the angels do. Just as they are aware of the Holy One, blessed be He, they are also aware of themselves and of the angels which surpass them. The knowledge of the stars and the spheres is less than the knowledge of the angels, but greater than that of men.
So there it is. In other words, they are living intelligences. And then number 10, he talks about the sublunar sphere, which is where matter is. And then he talks about the four elements, which are the common understanding of what are the elemental materials that make up the sublunar world, the material world, which is fire, air, earth, and water, right? And he talks about the fact that even these have levels, right? Highest is fire because it's the lightest. Then comes wind. Then comes water. Then comes earth because it's the thickest. Okay? And then he says in Halakha 11, they are not alive. They don't possess a soul. They are not conscious. Right? So that's the difference between the sublunar matter and the forms above. And if you go over to the beginning of chapter 4, he then talks about the 4 elements. And how everything in the sublunar sphere is made up of a combination of these elements. This is all Aristotelian physics, right? And he says everything that exists, this is the fascinating thing. He says, in effect, that everything, both living and dead, or living and non-living, in the sublunar sphere is made up of the same matter. Well, of course, scientifically, we believe the same thing today, that all matter that exists, whether living or non-living, is made up of the same kinds of chemicals and molecules. There's no difference.
Atomic particles is what you're looking for.
Well, even down to the level of some subatomic particles. In other words, if you want to look at the table of the elements, right? Okay?
Yeah.
And then, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, maybe I'm very naive. I think I am. But it seems to me pretty basic that man's scientific knowledge progresses.
Yes.
But there are still fundamental truths which he hooked into. I don't see where there's really that much of a conflict.
Well, I would have to say that I find the congruence is interesting, but we have to understand that the world as we understand it is radically different from the way they understood it.
Because we have grown in our into our knowledge.
The scientific knowledge we have is just so much vaster than anything they could have conceived of. That has to be the starting point.
And furthermore, our scientific knowledge is progressing rapidly.
Still.
Yes.
So we're very aware of the transience of its truth, right?
Right.
We know that which we absolutely know is true today won't be true in another generation.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And
We didn't know that.
Well, there was scientific progress in the Middle Ages. It's something that people don't recognize. There was considerable progress.
From one mistake to another mistake.
No. And especially in the realm of engineering, by the way, there was a lot of advances in technology and engineering, which interestingly enough, it was not done by scientists. Engineering was not scientifically connected until the 17th and 18th century. That prior to that, engineering was done basically by practical engineers, and they weren't professional engineers who although some of them, I guess, were in military terms. It was all done by trial and error and understanding of previous notions. It was only later on that science began trying to ascribe the abstract principles behind what we call engineering technology. So, for example, the whole idea of water power to power mills and all kinds of other machines, for example, for the creation of cloth and things like that, evolved enormously during the Middle Ages from what the Romans had developed. Okay?
They made greater use, is that what you're saying? They made much greater use of water power?
Oh,
They-
huge,
their
and
understand-
wind, by the way. In other words, if you take a look what the Romans developed, and the Romans had fairly sophisticated engineering skills. We all know that, right? But there were forms of what they created in terms of mills and the use of water power, which in the Middle Ages, just by trying out various technologies, they advanced enormously over what the Romans had. Okay? In other words, one of the most important things for the creation of cloth is called fullering, to fuller the cloth, I believe it's called, where the basic cloth has to be pounded in order to make it into a certain consistency to create certain kinds of cloth. And originally this was done by hand. They developed water mills that essentially made big things that pounded the stuff up and down and allowed for larger scale production of cloth. Yes?
The way you're talking implies that there is a dichotomy. There was then and then there is now. And the fact is, there is a continuum in the development.
Yes?
Right.
If I have a book called the Directory of Ancient Inventions.
Yes.
And if you look at what the Roman war machine had,
Sure.
it was spectacular.
Well, also concrete. The kind of concrete that the Romans developed, they're only now figuring out how they did it. Because Roman concrete is better than anything that we've produced today.
The aqueducts still
Yeah.
exist.
No, there is a continuum, but there are also what we might call periods when there is a leap forward of understanding. So the Copernican revolution, as people call it, was a radical change of the perspective on the universe. The old Ptolemaic universe was collapsing under its own complexity because of new observations of the planets that showed that the original system couldn't describe what was being observed. So Copernicus, with no new knowledge, took everything that was known in his day and he said, look, if we just put the sun at the center, it's going to change, it's going to make all the evidence make more sense. It took Galileo and then all the way up to Newton to actually create the scientific principles, and Kepler is involved in this, and Tycho Brahe, although he didn't like Copernicus. It was those scientists and other astronomers who were able to take Copernicus's idea and flesh it out so that it could become acceptable. Okay? And so there are times when there is a kind of leap forward.
It's called disruptive technology.
Well,
For example, the computers.
Yeah.
So what,
It's called a paradigm shift.
instead of having a linear increase,
Right.
you get
Well, what you have is exactly, you get a jump and you get a kind of static plane and then another jump. And the guy who invented the term the paradigm shift, Thomas Kuhn, famous historian of science, talks about the fact that communities of science accept a certain paradigm of looking at the universe, like the Ptolemaic universe, and they work within that paradigm, and they keep fiddling with it and fiddling with it and fiddling with it until somebody says, sorry, it's not working anymore, let's have a new paradigm, and a new community of scientists then coalesces around the new paradigm, and the old ones essentially die off, because most of the old ones just refuse to accept the new paradigm, right? So people have questioned Kuhn's approach, but it's still, it makes a lot of sense in many ways. Okay, so in chapter 4, he deals with the 4 elements, and in Halakha 2, he talks about all these various other aspects of what are called cold and warmth, moistness and dryness, and how these elements all sort of interact with each other. And then notice in Halakha 3, on page 7 of the material that I gave you last week, he says, every entity which is a combination of these 4 fundamental elements will ultimately decompose into them. Some will decompose after a few days, and others will decompose after many years. In other words, there is a constant recycling of these elements. These elements anything that's made of these elements will eventually break down into their 4 basic elements again and then be recombined into new things. Okay? And so that's what happens. Now, what's interesting, so he says in Halakha 5, these 4 fundamental elements are in a constant state of flux. Now, this is going to have a very interesting, and what is why is, if you look at 6, he says, the cycle of change is caused by the revolution of the spheres. In other words, it is the movement of the spheres that causes the elements to constantly move, reform, decompose, and reform again. Okay? And of course, he's using the Platonic notion that there are forms, there are eternal forms, and made up of matter. Okay? Now, what in effect, if you go to number 8, he says, the soul of all flesh is the form which was given by God. In other words, in humans, there is an extra dimension called the soul. Okay? And the soul, and again, there's more than one kind of soul, so to speak. It's something different. It's radically different from the 4 elements, and therefore it survives death and decomposition, right? He says, the form of this soul is not a combination of the fundamental elements into which it will ultimately decompose, nor does it come from the neshama, so that it would require the neshama as the neshama requires the body. That the neshama is the essential life force that's in all living things. Rather, it is from God, from heaven. And of course, one of the great problems that medieval philosophers like Maimonides and Sa'adja have to deal with is, well, if everybody's body decomposes into elements, and then the elements get reused in other forms, other living bodies, other people, how will God bring us back our bodies when we are resurrected at the end of time? Because the material of our bodies may have been reused by many people or animals, right? So this is where, by the way, some people feel the notion of creation from nothing was so critical, because in effect, some of them said, well, God will just create new bodies for us out of nothing. God doesn't need to use the same material. Others rejected that idea. When we get to Maimonides on resurrection, we'll see he had some real problems with resurrection because of this and other issues.
It seems like for Maimonides and probably many others, one way to say I don't know is to say God will do it, or God did it.
He never does that. He just admits the fact there are times when human knowledge is limited. He understands that human knowledge, even the greatest expositor of knowledge, like himself, there's a limit to which we can understand God, because God is God and we are not God.
Well, that's another way of putting it.
And I would think.
No, it's not an evasion. It's
not an evasion, but just.
It's a notion that there is a fundamental limitation of human knowledge, right? And comprehension.
But he doesn't admit that limitation.
Yes, he does.
When it comes to asserting, for example, that material things are made up of 4 elements.
Because that to him is established science and well-known knowledge.
So instead of saying I don't know.
No, he's saying I do know.
No, not about that. But about the resurrection of the body when Mashiach comes.
We'll get to that.
Instead of saying I don't know, he says God will do it.
No. He doesn't say that. He actually deals with it. He tries to understand it. He tries to understand how it would happen, because Maimonides is a naturalist. He doesn't like something that's supernatural. Everything in Maimonides is natural except for resurrection of the dead. That's the one supernatural thing that he must accept as a doctrine of rabbinic Judaism, right? By this point, it is a doctrine of Judaism. You must accept that God will resurrect the dead at the end of time. Otherwise, you are a heretic. So he has to accept it, at least publicly. He may have had private doubts about it, but it is the most unnatural event possible.
Doesn't he feel that God is supernatural?
No. Well, God is, in a sense, that God is not physical. God is above the natural world. But even Maimonides explains a lot of what we would call miracles as being parables, as being natural things that have been worked out. He doesn't like the idea of the intrusion of the supernatural into the natural.
But is God supernatural by his concept?
Yes, but God doesn't act as a... But again, it depends on how you find supernatural.
Okay.
If you understand it as above the natural world, yes, God is above the natural world. But God only works through the natural world. Right? Except for this one thing.
Except in resurrection.
Yeah.
To get back to this soul of all flesh, the form which was given by God, that's straight out of Plato.
Yes.
The form is what
Absolutely.
is there, so that he's taken that and
His form of Aristotelianism has a lot of Platonism in it, which was typical for medieval Aristotelianism. It was a combination of factors.
it works beautifully.
Yeah. So take a look on page 47, where in chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, he says these matters are discussed like a drop in the bucket, right? In other words, he says, and are very deep, but not as deep as those treated in the first and second chapters. In other words, when you're dealing with God, the matters are far more complicated. When you're dealing with the physical universe, they're not as complicated. So therefore, he talks about the fact that what he has just dealt with in chapters 3 and 4 is the Maaseh Bereshit. What Tversky says cosmogony, he's actually technically wrong. It's cosmology. Cosmogony, well, Maaseh Bereshit is both cosmogony and cosmology. Cosmogony is the beginning, how does the universe begin and evolve? Cosmology is what does it look like now, right? What Maimonides has essentially given us, however, is cosmology. What does the universe look like now in his day, right? And he says, our ancient sages enjoined that these matters are not to be expounded in public, but should be communicated and taught to an individual privately. And then let's look at number 11. This is critical. This is what I've mentioned before, but it's important we understand it. George, you want to read this? This is on page 47.
What distinction is there between the Maaseh Merkavah and Maaseh Bereshit? The subject matter of Maaseh Merkavah is not expounded even to an individual unless he is wise and able to draw conclusions independently. And then only the chapter headings are communicated to him. But the topics of the Maaseh Bereshit are taught to an individual, and even if he is unable to form independent conclusions, we nevertheless teach him as much as he is capable of learning on these matters. Why is the subject not taught in public? Because not everyone possesses the breadth of intellect requisite for obtaining an accurate grasp of the meaning and interpretation of all its content.
So there it is. In other words, but what's fascinating is that he has given you, in effect, a crash course on Maaseh Bereshit. Something he says is not taught in public, which, knowing that the Mishnah Torah was going to get published to a certain, and of course it does require a literate person to read it, nonetheless, in some ways, he feels that anybody who is literate should at least have a basic knowledge of science. And again, it's a crash course. I mean, there's a whole variety of medieval mathematics behind all of this, and all kinds of other things in terms of physics.
So this is what you were saying, that the one thing, Bereshit,
Yeah.
science is relatively understandable, but God, the spirituality,
Yes.
Merkavah,
Yep.
not so. Right?
Yep.
Vastly more complicated.
Okay, and then in 12, he sums up what it was at the beginning of chapter 2 about love and a fear, right? Okay? But take a look at chapter paragraph 13. George, you want to read it there? The
topics connected with these 5 precepts treated in the above 4 chapters are what our wise men called Pardes, paradise, as in the passage, 4 went into Pardes. And although these 4 were great men of Israel and great sages, they did not all possess the capacity to know and grasp these subjects clearly.
So in the passage he's talking about, it says 4 entered into Pardes. And the word Pardes is actually a Persian word meaning orchard. But by the time it arrives in the Talmudic period, it's actually even in biblical literature, in late biblical literature, the Persian word, which does mean orchard, but later on it comes to mean what we would call heaven, paradise, which is
That's the derivation, the root.
it is the root of paradise. It's the root of
I was
paradise.
thinking Orchard Eden.
Well, yeah, it's the Garden of Eden, exactly.
Yeah.
So these four men, famous sages, from what we understand, go on some kind of mystical journey, their souls, right? And it's a complex and difficult passage to explain. But what it says is, now from Maimonides, for him, this means these four great sages entered into the study of Maaseh Merkavah. And he said they did not all possess the capacity. The passage says one of them looked and died, one of them looked and went crazy, and one of them looked and became a heretic, and only one of them, Rabbi Akiva, exited in peace. Now, what they actually were doing is different from what Maimonides understands them to have done.
Rabbi, where is that?
Well, he doesn't give you the passage,
I see.
but it's from Chagiga.
We're relying upon our teacher.
Yes, well, it says in brackets, Chagiga, page 14 in the Talmudic tractate Chagiga. Okay, I think it's 14.
Commit that to memory.
I think it's 14. I think it's 14b. That's the section of the tractate where the Gemara deals with the Mishnah's discussion of what is the Maaseh Bereshit that you're not supposed to speak of in public. They go a whole long discussion of Maaseh Bereshit. Then they go into the Maaseh Merkavah, and this is the story they start with. Okay? So, in other words, and then notice what he says. George, keep reading.
Therefore, I say that it is not proper to dally in Pardes till one has first filled oneself with bread and meat, by which I mean knowledge of what is permitted and what forbidden, and similar distinctions in other classes of precepts.
First study standard halacha.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, would you mind going over the Hagiga 14 for those of us who cannot recall it immediately?
Well, I can't
1,
quote
2,
you.
3, and 4.
I can't give you the exact passage, but it's Rabbi Akiva.
Rabbi Akiva did good.
Yeah, he's the one who came out. Elazar ben Azariah, I believe, Ben Zoma, and Elisha ben Abulia, who was called Acher, the other.
What their names? What happened to them?
Well, the first one looked and died. The second one, Ben Zoma, went crazy, and there's a passage following which shows you how crazy he got. And the third became a heretic. That's why he's called Acher. And the last one, Rabbi Akiva, comes out in peace.
What were they looking at that caused that?
Well, they were doing what's called, we call Merkava mysticism, where they were doing intense ascetic practices and meditation in which their soul leaves their body and ascends through the spheres of heaven and through the seven palaces in the highest heaven to stand before the throne of God. Now, Rabbi Akiva warns them that when you get to the gate of a certain palace, there's going to be these bright marble, and don't say water, which means, because if you say water, then you don't really understand what you're seeing. And if you go to the Merkava text, they actually describe what happens. At every gate there are guardian angels, and you have to show them spiritual amulets with the right words on them to get through. And if you're unworthy, they beat the crap out of you with iron bars and throw you into a river of fire. Okay, it's a whole other topic. If you want to, it's early Jewish mysticism. It's pre-Kabbalah, and it is extremely strange stuff. But that's what the Talmud's talking about. That's not what Maimonides is talking about. He's taking this as a metaphor for the need to study. First, you study, as he says, meat and bread, which is the standard Jewish tradition of the laws of the Torah. And then if you're a smart guy, you study science. You study mathematics, you study astronomy, you study logic, you study medicine, you study all the sciences, right? And then if you're really good, your teacher recognizes it, then you get to study philosophy. And your teacher doesn't give you all of it at once. Your teacher brings you along with hints and bits. And ultimately there's things you have to come to by your own understanding. That's Maimonides' way of, for him, philosophy was an esoteric form of knowledge, not to be taught explicitly.
Did you learn it from Socrates? Or did Socrates learn it from
No, it was his own perspective on things. There were other philosophers in the Middle Ages who didn't feel that he did, who wrote very clear-cut, Jewish philosophers, very clear-cut treatises that they expected that anybody who could read Arabic would study, right? But the fact is that philosophy was dangerous because studied improperly, it could turn a person away from tradition.
Or drive them crazy, or kill them.
Well, most likely his greatest fear was they were not, if they didn't understand it, they would fall away from being from the path of the Torah. And that's why the guide is called the Guide for the Perplexed. And in fact, there were traditionalists who saw this danger in the study of philosophy, and it's the reason why there were what are called the Maimonidean controversies, where the publication of the guide caused controversies in different Jewish communities, where there were traditionalists who forbade the study of philosophy as dangerous to one's faith. And there were two outbreaks of this, one around the time of Maimonides himself a little, and one in the 14th century. And because of this, by the end of the Middle Ages, while the Mishnah Torah was well studied and well established, people were not reading the guide because it was considered dangerous, and Jewish philosophy, essentially as a form of Jewish spiritual activity, came to an end, and Kabbalah became the kind of most popular and most widespread form of Jewish spiritual undertaking. Jewish philosophy, although Maimonides the philosophical works were never completely lost. There were still some people who were reading them. But Jewish philosophy as a creative endeavor was only revived in the 19th century, actually in the late 18th century with Moses Mendelssohn. And it only became again a kind of, and it was in Germany under the influence of German philosophy, right? So there was a gap of several hundred years where Jewish philosophy faded as an intellectual activity for the most part.
Because of the potential danger?
Yes.
Because communities
Yes.
shunned, in a way, communities wanted to keep it.
Yes, because they were afraid that people who studied philosophy, and by the way, would become non-believers or non-practitioners. I mean, even Philo, back in the first century, recognized that if you interpret everything in the tradition allegorically, there will be people who will say, well, I understand the allegory, I don't have to follow the law. And he was attacking both people in Philo understood that danger, and he attacked people who understood stuff literally and who therefore did not accept that there was a deeper meaning to things. And he also attacked people who saying, well, I understand the allegory, so I don't have to do the mitzvah. He's saying, no, you can't do that, right? Because he was a good observant Jew in whatever way he was an observant Jew. We're not sure. But the point is, there is a problem. Philosophy can be dangerous if it can be.
Well, it can make you think.
Well, no.
It takes you away from blind belief.
No, it can take you away from blind belief, and also what it does to the concept of God, and this is the reason why it was not a popular kind of knowledge, it makes God very abstract.
Yeah.
Right?
They go with blind belief. They go to religion.
Well, blind belief, unfortunately, can lead to a kind of fundamentalism, which is also dangerous. So anyway, so take a look. He says, read on.
Although, we're at although, I believe.
Yeah, these last
Although
subjects.
these last subjects were called by the sages a small thing, when they say a great thing, ma'aseh merkavah, a small thing, the discussion of Abbé and Rava, still they should have the precedence, for the knowledge of these things gives primarily composure to the mind. They are the precious boon bestowed by God to promote social well-being on earth and to enable men to obtain bliss in the life hereafter. Moreover, the knowledge of them is within reach of all, young and old, men and women, those gifted with great intellectual capacity, as well as those whose intelligence is limited.
In other words, what is the function of the law? Right? The function of the law in Maimonides' terms is personal well-being and societal well-being, right? That's what he thinks the laws are about. You need to have the laws of the Torah to create personal well-being, which allows you, for those who can do it, intellectual development, and if you're part of the elite who go on and study philosophy, but for your average person, it provides them with personal well-being, composure of the mind. He considers it a healthy body, a healthy mind, and in addition to which the function of many of the mitzvot are to create a just and livable and peaceful society, right? And it is only in that kind of society that philosophy can flourish, right? When people's needs are met, when they're able to have the leisure time to study, you cannot have, he says, good intellectual development in times of war, societal disruption, and all kinds of things. So in his guide, this is Maimonides in a nutshell, what he goes into in great detail in the guide, when in the third part of the guide he talks about the meaning of the mitzvot. He is, in effect, he's got a political agenda. The political agenda is the creation of a society in which is peaceful, prosperous, and just. And that society will produce great philosophers. Okay, chapter 5 is about the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name. Okay, and what his major discussion is in here is, in other words, you are to uphold the commandments to the point, but only a few of them are you to allow yourself to be martyred for. So what he does is, in the passages given, he talks about the limits of Kiddush Hashem. Now, as Kiddush Hashem can be a small thing. It's doing something in public which, in effect, says, oh, that person is a good person, and therefore I respect them and their religion. If you do something corrupt in public, it denigrates not just you, but your faith and your people. I'll give you a personal example I always give of a small act of Kiddush Hashem. In my first pulpit, the neighborhood I lived in, there was a butcher who was kosher style. Not kosher, but kosher style, which means he didn't sell pork, he didn't sell anything that was biblically treif, let us say, but he was not under rabbinic supervision, and observant Jews who kept kosher didn't shop there, but a lot of other Jews did, okay? All right, and it was called Nortowns. Anyway, one day I had gone to a shoe repair place, and I had a pair of shoes fixed or reshined, rehealed, whatever, and the guy gives me my shoes back, and he puts them in a plastic bag from Nortowns. He's recycling the bag. And I'm carrying my shoes in a bag, in a Nortowns bag along the street. And I realize if anybody sees me who knows me as a rabbi, they're going to say, what? Rabbi Troster buys his meat at Nortown? Which would be a Chilul Hashem. So I took the bag, wrapped it up, and stuck it under my arm. That's a small example of what it's about. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but it appeared as if I was doing something wrong. It's also called Mariat Ayin, that you have to not only do right, but be seen to be doing right. But to let people, well, yes, well, a rabbi has but every Jew. So in other words, if I had allowed somebody to think that I shopped at Nortowns, that would be a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. So it comes down to when a Jew like Bosky or what's his name more recently, Madoff. This is a Chilul Hashem because it looks at people and say, oh, Jews are crooks. And that's a kind of a societal version of it, almost a secularized version of it. But it's a very important idea. But the question is, what are the limits? And classically, the rabbis have said there are certain mitzvot that you can break any mitzvah to save your life, except for certain mitzvot, for which you must allow yourself to die. Okay, so Maimonides, that's really what he's talking about here, right? He talks about the fact that you must live by the laws, and you are, if you are forced, like, a guy you're in an alley and a guy comes up to you with a knife and says, "Eat this ham sandwich or I'm going to kill you." You eat the ham sandwich, right? I mean, if you say no, I won't. I mean, you die. That's stupid and it's a violation. Okay, and so he says this rule applies. This is paragraph 2 on page 49 to all the commandments except the prohibitions of idolatry and chastity and murder. Those things, if you say, "I will kill you unless you kill so and so," you must allow yourself to be killed. So then he goes into the, examples of it. And then what's interesting is he says all the foregoing applies to a time free from religious persecution. But when there is
Where are you up to?
number 3, but if there is a time of religious persecution, then you're not allowed to publicly violate any of the mitzvot. Okay? So that's really what the chapter is about. It's about martyrdom. It's about what are the boundaries of martyrdom. Okay, and if you and again, he's only giving us excerpts here because in the full text he gives you a whole list of stuff of what's considered a chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. Okay, the next section is that's a Yesodei HaTorah. Those are the fundamentals of Torah. Anybody want to ask any further? Yes. Now. What we don't have here, which Troster didn't give us, are several other chapters. Chapter 6 is about because this is connected to Kiddush Hashem, is about physically destroying God's name, Yud He Vav He. That's what chapter 6 is about. Chapter 7, which we're going to look at, is about prophecy. Chapter 8 is further discussion of prophecy, which is about the miracles of Moses. Chapter 9 is about not changing the Torah and also more rules of prophecy. And chapter 10 is what do you do if a prophet, somebody claims to be a prophet, what are the tests you must apply to see whether in fact they are a prophet? And also he has an attack there on magicians and astrology, which he will elaborate on elsewhere. So I want to look, the material I sent you yesterday, anybody not have it, by the way?
Sure, if I received it.
It was in the email I sent out to everybody.
Should have printed it, but I don't think
Do you have it, Risa?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, George, you need one? Okay, I made 5 copies. This is part of chapter 7. Do you want chapter 7? Because I thought it would be interesting to take a quick look at some of the material in chapter 7 of Yesodei HaTorah. And what we're going to do is we'll take a look at this.
So you're not going to spend more time discussing the limits of martyrdom?
No, I just wanted to survey that with you. I'm really interested in this, and next week we're going to move on to the next treatise, which is about moral dispositions. In other words,
I just wish to sort of put a little roadblock.
Yeah.
Say, I think that is one of the most fundamental things which a Jew will ever have to address, because it takes you to how you had to behave during the Shoah. It is one of those things where we need to understand where there is a limit to what we are and are not permitted to do.
Yes. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply to the Shoah, because martyrdom comes from the Greek word for witness. You are a witness to your faith. You are given a choice, right? Change your faith, break your faith, or die. And if you choose to die, you are a witness to your faith. The Shoah actually does not fit within the classic definition of a martyrdom.
There was no choice.
There was no choice. So one of the interesting things, and this is really not the place to discuss it in detail, is that modern Jewish commentators on the Shoah, including rabbis in Europe during the Shoah, redefined martyrdom to be that if you are killed because you are Jewish, you are a martyr. Which is a very different definition, right? Because there was no choice.
And what consequence does that have?
It means then you are considered in traditional faith to be a holy one, specially blessed. rewarded by God in the next life because you died for your faith. I mean, there's, martyrs like in Christianity, in our tradition, hold a special place.
So martyrdom is a choice.
Classical martyrdom is a choice.
This was a depreciation of the term.
No, it's a redefinition.
Well, but it broadened it inappropriately.
No, I think it broadened it appropriately to fit a new situation that had never happened before. Okay? Most times Jews were, before the modern period, Jews had a choice, usually, to convert. Not exclusively, but most of the time when they were attacked, they had a choice. Okay?
But the heroism of the martyr is by the option he chooses.
Yes.
And I knew a guy who died in 9/11 on one of the planes. He was
Right.
a schleppy, jerky little guy
Right.
who cheated in business and then 2 years later someone said, he died in that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. And I said, that couldn't have been that guy. That guy was a schlep. That guy was a jerk. He couldn't have had a heroic death. And I really felt that. But of course, there was nothing heroic about that. That was, he wasn't a martyr.
But
he was on the wrong plane.
Well, and you know what? I mean, there were people in the Shoah who were murdered as Jews who didn't even think of themselves as Jews because their parents or their grandparents had converted and they thought themselves as Christians. And the Nazis redefined what it meant to be Jewish, right? In racial terms. So are they martyrs? The fact of the matter is that because the Shoah was such a great trauma, anyone who in the least bit was considered to be Jewish by the Nazis, religious authorities have redefined them as martyrs just by the fact that they were Jewish.
I apologize for saying, for dragging you down
No.
but I'm very glad.
No, it's okay.
Clarify.
I mean, it's an interesting subject, and at some point, if you're interested in religious responses to the Holocaust as a topic for a course, we can look at that material. It's a very interesting issue. And a very difficult one, by the way.
Can I go back very quickly to the Inquisition rather than...
Yeah.
He says here in the paragraph 3,
Yeah.
in times of religious persecution.
Yes.
Well, didn't his family do the opposite?
Well, what's interesting is that there is... he wrote, his father wrote an official epistle on this, and he wrote an epistle on this, that it is, in a case like what happened in Spain, it was okay to, on the surface, pretend to be a Muslim, but you are supposed to get away from that situation as quickly as you can. You're supposed to go to a place. And this was a great relief for many Jews, by the way. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I mean, Cairo was filled with refugees from the area of North Africa under the places who had been religiously persecuted. So it's interesting. You're right. Sometimes in the Mishnah Torah, he's giving you the clear, definite principles. But in practice as a judge, he was often a lot more lenient, as I mentioned to you, than the strictness of that the law said. So this was a situation where not just only his own situation, but the situation of thousands of Jews. His father started it, but he continued it. This notion of great leniency to those who converted to Islam in order to escape death, but lived quietly as Jews and then tried to get out of there as quickly as they could. Right? Okay, so chapter 7 is about prophecy. And the reason why I wanted to show this to you is, and prophecy takes up a large part of part 2 of the guide. But I wanted to show you part of this anyway. We're not going to look at all of it, but take a look at Halakha 1. Robert, do you want to start reading this? This is on the material that I gave out to you.
It is one of the foundations of our faith that God conveys prophecy to man. Prophecy is bestowed only upon a very wise sage of a strong character who is never overcome by his natural inclinations in any regard. Instead, with his mind, he overcomes his natural inclinations at all times. He must also possess a very broad and accurate mental capacity.
Now, he's going to get further in this, but notice what he's saying. God doesn't just choose some schmo on the street to talk to. The person has to be a sage, the right mental capacity, Maimonides will even go further and claim that the prophets are all people who've studied philosophy, in effect. Yes, Risa?
I'm a psychologist.
Yes.
So what struck me in particular was the assumption that everything natural proceeds from the Yetzer Hara. That it has to be overcome, suppressed, all of those things. That is such a cynical and really pessimistic view of humanity. And I wonder how he squared it in his own mind.
Well,
With the supposed resemblance of us to God. Since that cannot be physical, obviously, it must be internal.
I would disagree with you. The rabbi's anthropology, that each of us are composed of what we call the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. And the Yetzer Hara I do not like to translate as evil. It is our capacity for our self needs, our physical needs, and it only becomes evil when they become excessive. And the Yetzer HaTov is our altruistic tendency. This is the psychoanthropology of the rabbis, which I think was a very wise kind of approach. You can compare it to the id and the superego of Freud, okay?
Precisely.
And that what the rabbis said was you can't suppress your Yetzer Hara totally, otherwise you'd stop eating, right?
Eating is considered part.
Yeah, any of your material physical needs are your natural desires, are your earthly animalistic needs, are what the Yetzer Hara is, okay? Which is why, again, I don't like translating it as evil, because it's necessary. You cannot destroy the Yetzer Hara because then you will sit there, meditate, and starve to death, okay? Now, what does it mean? It means you are to channel it into constructive elements. And in effect, I'm going to find the Hebrew word that he uses here when he talks about natural inclinations. He talks about it as actually midotav, meaning his characteristics. The natural characteristics of what it means to be human have to be controlled, right?
Well, that's
in other words, they're not destroyed. He does use the word yitzro, right? Our natural tendencies to want to eat too much, to want to drink too much, to want to have sex too much, right? Maimonides was...
What is the word in Hebrew? Would you say?
Yetzer Hara.
Yeah.
Yetzer. H-A-R-A-H. Yetzer Hara. So what he is saying is that a person, part of becoming, by the way, a healthy person, is having a balance between your needs. He's going to, in the next treatise, he's going to talk about the golden mean, right? Because he doesn't believe in asceticism, although his kind of life, we would consider him slightly ascetic, but he doesn't believe in extreme asceticism. So he's not talking about extreme asceticism here. Mm-hmm. He's not.
He seems to be equating what is natural with what is harmful.
No, he's not. On the contrary, what he's talking about is controlling it, right?
So why doesn't he say so?
Well, because that's what he means. That's what he means. He says...
He did say so.
See, no, the problem is probably the translation. He's talking about dea. Your dea overcomes your yetzer, okay? Or controls... the word is kind of has control over or has strength over. And what does your dea is your mental capacity is able to control your physical needs in a constructive way, okay? At all times. In other words, the guy who gives in to gluttony and other kinds of things, he refers to the person as Baal De'ah, meaning a master of their own mind, right? And so this is the kind of person. In other words, a dissolute glutton is not going to become a prophet. That's what he's talking about. This is not an unhealthy attitude. When you read about when he talks about his moral dispositions, it's an extremely healthy way of looking at life. It's about balance. Okay?
I wish he had said so.
Well, that's what he...
Shining light
No,
on it.
that's what he means. I'm telling you what he means.
I know that.
because I'm looking at the Hebrew, and that's what he means. And I also know it from other stuff he's written.
From studying the Bible, are all prophets of that kind?
No.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
I thought when
Yes.
you become something.
Yes,
extraordinary.
exactly. This is where Maimonides is fascinating. For him, he cannot conceive of an average Joe being a prophet.
Becoming a prophet.
Exactly. Whereas the prophet Amos said, when God's, Amos is a guy who says he's a herder and a dresser of sycamore trees. He's a peasant. And God speaks to him and he becomes a prophet. Right? Okay? And Amos says, when God speaks, who can but prophesy? And when you look in the Bible, there is no indication necessarily that God picks out men and women, by the way, of great mental capacity and balance and so on. I mean, think about it. Elijah is told to make Elisha his successor. Elisha is found plowing a field. Elisha has a terrible temper. He apparently was bald, and when a bunch of kids yelled at him, baldy, baldy, he sent a bunch of bears to kill them. Okay?
Where did you get the bear?
The fact is, you would not want to have the prophet Elijah for dinner. Okay?
No, not have him for dinner.
No, I mean,
Have dinner with
have dinner with him, all right?
How could Maimonides, knowing the Bible as he did, come to such a different conclusion?
Because for him, prophecy is physically and mentally only possible to the person who is of great mental capacity, as you say, and able to balance their physical needs, right? And has great knowledge. Look at what he says. Read the next paragraph.
a person who is full of all these qualities and is physically sound is fit for prophecy. When he enters the Pardes and is drawn into these great and sublime concepts, if he possesses an accurate mental capacity to comprehend and grasp them, he will become holy. He will advance and separate himself from the masses who proceed in the darkness of the time. He must continue and diligently train himself not to have any thoughts whatsoever about fruitless things or the vanities and intrigues of the times. Instead, his mind should constantly be directed upwards, bound beneath God's throne of glory, striving to comprehend the holy and pure forms and gazing at the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, in its entirety, in its manifold manifestations, from the most elevated spiritual form until the navel of the earth, appreciating His greatness from them.
Stop there. All right. So what does a prophet, before he becomes a prophet, have to be? Physically fit, mentally sound, must spend his time in contemplation of spiritual matters, i.e. become a philosopher. And when he has done this, right, and
After
he,
these preparations,
yes.
the divine spirit will immediately rest upon him.
So, in other words, only those who've gone through this incredible preparation will then have the divine spirit come upon them.
Automatically.
Not quite. He doesn't quite believe that. And notice what it says. Read the next sentence.
When the spirit rests upon him, his soul becomes intermingled with the angels called Ishim,
Those are the lowest level of the celestial beings.
and he will be transformed into a different person and will understand with a knowledge different from what it was previously. He will rise above the level of the other wise men, as the prophet Samuel told Saul. The Spirit of God will descend upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, and you will be transformed into a different person.
In other words, and when you look at the guide, he talks about this in detail in the last chapters of the guide. And Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote a biography of Maimonides many years ago. I don't know if it's still in print. And Heschel believed that Maimonides had thought that he had reached this point, that he had reached the level where he could become a true prophet. The question that we do not know is whether or not Maimonides felt that he had received this divine spirit, that whether he in fact thought he himself was a prophet. But certainly it's very likely, as Heschel said, that Maimonides believed that he had reached the state where he could become a prophet. Ultimately, it is the divine grace that decides. But you notice, here you're right, he's completely contradicting the Bible. And in fact, Yehuda Halevi takes in his work, the Kuzari takes much more the idea that God decides who's going to be a prophet, but one thing that Yehuda Halevi does is the only place he says that prophecy can occur is in the land of Israel, because he believed there was something spiritually different about the land of Israel than any other land. Doesn't explain why Ezekiel got his prophecy in Babylon, but nonetheless. You know what? When I first read this, did any of you ever see the play Amadeus or the movie?
Yes.
Well, the play is a lot better than the movie. The play is a fascinating intellectual thing. And, it's not 100% historically accurate. And when I saw it, the first thing I was struck by was Salieri is Maimonides, right? Salieri is a good, virtuous man, pious. And along comes this licentious, disgusting jerk, and God speaks through Mozart. Salieri in the play hears Mozart's music, and he realizes that he is hearing the voice of God, that God is speaking through Mozart's music, and he's so angry at God, he decides to go in completely in the opposite direction and destroy Mozart. It's a brilliant intellectual play. Again, only partially based on real history, but I've seen it twice live on stage. First time with the second cast on Broadway. I was like sitting there intellectually grasped by this. Was fascinating, and all I could think of was this idea that Salieri is like Maimonides. He's expecting that the divine spirit should come upon him because he's mentally fit and pious and all the things, ready, and it goes to Mozart, who's this excuse the language, this arrogant, licentious, disgusting little shit, and I just loved it. I saw it live on stage. Also, it's in Stratford, Ontario, and the movie was okay. But the movie, I think, really didn't get what it was really about.
Of course, there's another
Peter
factor.
Schaefer, my nephew spoke to Peter Schaefer.
Yeah.
And Peter Schaefer was very upset by the way they portrayed Mozart in the movie.
Yeah.
He said that wasn't the intent of what he wrote.
Exactly. So that's why the play was a heck of a lot better. And I have a copy of the play. And
Playwright? He was the
Peter
playwright.
Schaefer, yeah, he's also the guy who wrote Equus. I bought a copy of the play because I wanted to, get. It's just a brilliant play.
A further complicating thing is that people don't really know the difference. They don't appreciate that Mozart's better. It's really Salieri alone.
Yes.
Who knows that Mozart's the chosen one.
Yes.
And he's nobody.
Exactly.
In the movie, Mozart was way up here and Salieri was here.
Right. But I mean, in reality, the Salieri was highly esteemed in his own day, and so on and so forth. And Salieri was a great composer. But in the play, he sees everything that he's done is mediocre compared to the voice of God that is heard in the beauty of Mozart's music.
And
right?
He was right.
Actually, if you listen to Salieri's work, he's damn good, okay?
But he ain't no Mozart.
No, there's no truth to the fact that Salieri murdered Mozart. I mean, there's no truth to that at all. What's fascinating is how the play takes aspects of Mozart's life and has Salieri being, like he's the guy who advises him to write the magic flute, which gets the Masons pissed off at him, which means he loses all this kind of money, which means he ends up starving. And through all of it, Mozart doesn't realize it's Salieri undermining him at every possible stroke, okay? It's a brilliant play, and that's why I gave you this prophecy stuff. And if you take a look at the rest of the chapter, he talks about the levels of prophecy. He sees sharp distinctions between different prophets, okay? And so he describes that, and the reason why he does that, and halakha number 6 is about the difference between all the other prophets and Moses. Moses is distinctly different than the rest of the prophets. And what we'll do next week is we'll take a look at this because it is so important for Maimonides to see in his whole schema of what prophecy is about and what Torah is about, Moses has to be quantitatively and qualitatively essentially different than any of the other prophets. For him, Moses is the one who reached the highest level of intellectual attainment that a human being can reach, and the highest level of spiritual attainment, which is why the metaphor, and he sees this as a metaphor, is he was the only one who was described as talking with God face to face.
What about Abraham?
No, Abraham, he doesn't see Abraham as the same level, but in his section on idolatry, which you'll look, he sees Abraham as the first monotheist, and basing himself on rabbinic midrash, that Maimonides, that Abraham was the first human to come to an apprehension of God through rational deduction of the natural world. So in other words, what Maimonides is in effect saying is that a man can come to the notion of a monotheistic God without the Torah. This was the big problem about philosophy, right? If I can come to an understanding of God without the Torah, then what do I need the Torah for?
No, but my question, Rabbi, is the fight with God wanting to destroy Sodom and Abraham humbling him down to 10. That isn't a human speaking with God.
It is, yes. Abraham is a prophet, but not on the same level as Moses. Why? Because Moses received the legislation of the Torah. That's the difference. All other prophets, got messages from God, got ideas that God from God, but none of them promulgated legislation. They all upheld legislation, elaborated legislation, but the only one to receive the divine commandments was Moses. All right, we'll see you next week.
What's the other term?